Don't do that. Okay, good. G'day, hi, and welcome. All right, so, World War III update. Why not? Sure. Yeah, I'll do it. I'm good for it. Okay. MiG-29 shot down over Ukraine. Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. Sometimes it does this, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, yeah, so MiG-29 shot down. Reports of more Russian aircraft, anti-aircraft equipment going across into the Ukraine. Whether it's true or not, who knows? The convoy is stuck at the border. Yeah, so it's still, tensions are as high as they could be in the Ukraine. So, not a big report here, but you can see it is escalating. I mean, the Russians, whether they're in Kiev, or not in Kiev, but in the Donetsk region or not, is not really, a no-brainer, but it's not really, an impossibility either. But what I'm more thinking is what they're doing is they're training most of the guys, and I know like some of these surface-to-air missile systems do take a lot of training to use them properly, but you can show a monkey how to get it working, you know what I mean? So it does look like, okay, now you got a MiG-29 shot down, the pilot did eject. This isn't a big deal, but it just kind of shows you that the Air Force, Ukrainian Air Force, cannot really seem to make good headway into that region. So that means, what they're getting shot down faster than they can return fire, okay, and destroy the surface-to-air missile systems. So when Crimea was basically repatriated by the, annexed by the Russians, there was a convoy of S-300 missile systems that did go into that region. Now, Crimea is not even mentioned on the mainstream media. Nobody's talking about it because they know for sure that the Russians are there. My thing is this: if the Russians are supplying the rebels, which they are, and again, you have to understand, you have basically Blackwater guys, you have, Russian Secret Service running around there. You've got all these factions in there. You've probably got about 20 different factions, including the Mossad. They're all in there. They're all in there. But the problem is that the people that are getting caught in the crossfire deliberately are suffering the most. Now, Russia doesn't mind these people suffering. Why? Because every time the Ukrainian forces do something to them, well, they're just like in 10 years, they've conquered half the country, and it's now going to be like an East-West Germany kind of setup. But the thing is the Ukrainian forces cannot seem to really make that good of headway. They gain some ground, but again, you're fighting an insurgency. You can't win an insurgency. You just can't win that unless you just completely genocide everybody that's there, which, it's not like they're not trying to do that. Again, what they're doing on the eastern side of Ukraine is identical to what Israel's doing to the Gazans, or the Palestinians in Gaza. So, there's no difference, and so there's no good guys there, There's just a lot of innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. So what does this entail? So if you really do have more Russian stuff, again, they never show you anything. It's funny how they can tell, oh yeah, well, we're watching it in real time and everything, but we're not going to show you because we want to show you our intelligence. Well, then, why would you even admit it? You know what I mean? Like, why would you even say they're doing this unless, they won't show you anything. So what I'm thinking is that, yes, it's still the rebels being trained by the Russians on the Russian side, and then they just come over as they see fit and go back and forth. That said, I made a couple of videos the other day. I didn't get a chance to post them, and I'm going to post them all today. And I know some of them are long and stuff like that, but I'm still waiting for the desperate Ukrainian pilot or whatever, most likely going to be a pilot. I would assume they would use the Su-27 because of its longer range and try to make a really deep strike somewhere into Russia. Getting shot down into Russia, then you would see it ratchet up to the next level. But again, when they're shooting down MiG-29s, MiG-29 is, even the older ones now, the Ukrainians didn't get, they've got the Russian hand-me-down. So yes, the Russians still fly MiG-29s. And they got quite a few of them. I think there was like 1,600 built or whatever. I mean, those numbers change. The Russians never kept serial numbers on stuff. You don't know how many's out there. But the Ukrainians got the older Su-27s and stuff like that, which even still by today's standard are really, really good airplanes. However, it's all about pilot training. So how good are the Ukrainian pilots? I mean, they would be trained in Russian tactics for sure, but how good are they? I don't know. I don't know. But considering that almost every other day there's a Ukrainian aircraft getting shot down, considering they only have about 150 fighters or something like that. I remember there was a tally a couple of months ago of what the Ukrainians have. They're running out of stuff. At this rate, this time next year, they're going to be flying cloth-wing biplanes. You know what I mean? Or kites. I don't know what they're going to be flying. They're running out. They're running out fast. So again, the Russians really don't have to do much here. They, because they've got the rebels or freedom fighters or terrorists, whatever you want to refer to them as. But basically, you got Group A is shooting at Group B. That's it. It's the same. It's the same play everywhere. Divide and conquer. So all the Russians have to do is, okay. Well, again, this is leading up to what a comment I made the other day that some people thought it was nuts and off my rocker. Okay, so you've got not the official Russian military in there shooting down stuff with their, but you do have rebels in there using the SA-11s and possibly the S-300s or whatever. Okay, and they're shooting down these airplanes. They're probably been shooting a lot of the helicopters down just with RPGs, because I know a few of them were taken out with RPGs, RPG-7, so that's pretty low tech. So you got the Ukrainian military, or Air Force, cannot make a dent on that, in the sense. So they're indiscriminately killing people here and there, carpet bombing, whatever. Maybe they are shooting at some rebels here and there, but the carpet bomb an area where the rebels are, well, they kill the civilians too, right? So, it's the same thing that's going on in Gaza, right? So the thing is, again, you've got the ragtag part of the military that's there. You've got probably a few Russian special forces, kind of, and yes, there was footage of Russian commanders. This was seen on Vice a few months ago. That did come in, and they're probably giving these guys instruction and training and stuff like that. So that's how a proxy war works. It's how it worked against the Afghanis and the Russians back in the 1970s, 1980s. The CIA trained the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen shot down Russian stuff with American air-made things. Taliban ousted the Mujahideen, and when Desert Storm came around, or not Desert Storm, Afghanistan came around, Apache helicopters were getting shot down by American-made Stinger missiles, and people were saying, well, how did they get these, again, when you arm the people, you have to fight in the future, right? But the difference with the Russians is the people they're arming is, are Russian. It's not, okay, well, here's some Kazakhstanis, people from Kazakhstan that were arming to fight whoever, that don't have anything to do with Russia. They're not arming the Tartars. They're not arming, you know what I mean? They're arming the Russian people that are in the Ukraine. And they're arming them well enough that they can shoot down a good proportion. I don't know what's that, 30 Ukrainian aircraft that have been shot down so far. So what this is telling you, and this is going to be the build-up to everything that I'm talking about, it's not so much the incident you have to look at. You have to look at the overall picture. What this is telling the Russians is, we can win the war through a bunch of ragtag rebels. We don't even have to send in our good guys, like our best trained guys. We'll just train them up well enough. And, if they want to fight for 5 years, like I say, this time next year at the rate they're going, if they're shooting down MiG-29s, they're shooting down Frogfoots, tons of helicopters, you notice that there's no AWACS that are coming in there as much. There was a British one, but it stayed, into Poland. It didn't come right in. But the AWACS don't have to get close anyway. But there's a reason why you're not seeing AWACS and stuff getting shot down, is because that means there is probably S-300 missile systems, most likely in the Crimea area. And they don't have to go into the Ukrainian part of Donetsk or anything like that. They don't have to go there. Why? Because the range on these S-300 missile systems is like 400 kilometers. So, they can cover the country pretty, they can cover their area pretty good. So they're shooting down Ukrainian, helicopters and fighter jets pretty much left, and attack aircraft left, right, and center. Okay? So that means tomorrow there's one MiG-29 less. Even if the pilot survives, the pilots will only survive so many shooting downs, right? And they've lost how many armor, they got like 15,000 armored columns, and they've lost, probably a couple of hundred, maybe 300-400 by now. I don't know the number. I'm sure somebody will, correct me on the number, but we'll just say they lost 300. I'm just throwing that number out there. Maybe they lost 30, maybe they lost 10, but I'm pretty sure they lost more than 10. So again, how long does 15,000 APCs last you? How long does, especially when the people that you're fighting, in the country you're at war with is the country that was supplying them. What happens when these MiG-29s blows a couple of seals and gaskets? Who fixes them? You know what I mean? Now, yes, the Ukrainians did manufacture a lot of stuff for the Russians in this thing, but again, it's like when Iran ended up with the M14s, they couldn't get parts for them. So they had them, but they couldn't get parts for them. So you fly them until they're broken, and you got an oversized paperweight, right? And that's what's going to happen to a lot of the, the APCs that and all that the Ukrainians have. So that's what Russia's figured out. They don't need to roll tanks into there because the Ukrainian military is not well equipped enough to really put up a fight back, and you can bleed them out slowly. So meaning after, when they get down to 5,000 or 8,000 APCs or whatever it is, they're either going to surrender, give up, or call a truce. Something like that's going to happen. Why? Because they know they just cannot take the Russians. But it doesn't mean you're not going to get the radicals in there that are going to try to, like I say, make a flight across the border and do an airstrike. If they're willing to send artillery shells into the Russian side of the border, they're willing to fly. And I'm sure it'll be a black swan, like a bunch of guys who don't listen to the generals in Kiev anymore, and they're just say, we're gonna fix this ourselves. And then once you get Ukrainian aircraft shot down over Russia, almost a guarantee that's going to happen. Almost a guarantee. And Russians will have to respond at that point. What they will probably do, okay, and this is the picture I want to paint for people. Again, the Russians, they've got a million-man army and God knows how many reservists and whatever. They don't even have to bring out the frontline equipment to tie up the resources. In fact, much of the stuff that's going into the Crimea is the older stuff. Why burn it up? Use that, waste that on your enemy, and then whenever they're really down, then you send in the state-of-the-art stuff. And I mean, think about it this way. If the Russians really wanted to take out the Ukrainian military overnight type of thing, they'd be setting up the rebels with Black Shark and Alligator helicopters. Go in. You got 12 Vicar missiles each, send in a couple of MIL-28 Havocs. 16 Vicars, 4 Eaglas, and 40 80-millimeter S-8 rockets. You could, and 500 rounds of 30-millimeter cannon. One aircraft, let alone 6 of them flying in formation, is going to just devastate the snotballs out of anything that Kiev has to throw out of it. And that's the state of the art. But they're not sending that in. They don't need to. They're not sending in the Black Sharks. They're not sending in the Havocs. The MIL-24s are okay, but unless they're sending in the MIL-35 variant, that's not the state of the art. The other stuff is older. So they're just bleeding out the Ukrainians slowly. So they're definitely not taking them as an extremely serious threat. But they are fearful of NATO. Now, this is what I'm talking about. When we get whatever the incident is going to be, maybe it'll be a desperate Ukrainian armored military column, but it would get maybe 10 feet into the border. So I say airstrike makes more of a sense. So they fly in with Su-27s because they've got the range, and maybe the Frogfoots, they've got the range. They go after a couple of border Russian. Not right on the border, but deep inside, like I'm talking a couple of 100 miles into the Russian territory. They try to make a strike. They get a few airplanes shot down. Russia responds by rolling tanks, and it'll probably be second-line tanks. It'll be, like the older T-72s and the BMP 1s and 2s, rolling right up to the Ukrainian border. NATO gets ready for that, and while NATO is ready, this is who Russia knows that if they were to roll into Ukraine, okay, and this is why they don't roll into Ukraine. NATO is right in the flank to just kind of roll right over top of them. It would be a suicide mission. This is why I say they're going to come through Norway. They're going to come through, they'll probably use the Navy to attack Sweden. They're going to keep them at bay, and God knows what they're going to, they'd probably come in through the Baltic with, definitely going to be air power that would do this. But they'd use the armored columns to basically, draw attention, so NATO would respond from Poland into that. They would roll into Poland, basically take out the airfields, all that stuff. The priority is air power. Before a ground invasion, you always have airstrikes, okay? So that's where you get your bombers. Now, they would also go after England, too, because England is a big player in this, right? So that's when you're talking about the superpowers of Europe, you're talking England. They've got the Typhoon fighter, which is really designed just to take on the Russian forces. It's a really good airplane and stuff like that. Is it as good as the Su-35? I don't know, but the Su-35 is relatively low in numbers. The Su-27s, there's lots of them. The Russians, and Putin has talked about this, in 2010, he was like, after, Obama started, shaking and rattling the cage, he said, look, Russia's not this rusted out, our military isn't rusted out anymore. We've been doing upgrade programs like crazy. The Tu-160 Blackjacks these are the things, because I did a thing on the bombers. Now I want to clarify how the Russian bombers are going to work. To the best of my knowledge, okay, this is what they'd most likely send in to take out NATO stuff. If they take in, there's I think only maybe 16 Tu-160s, again low in number, but very sophisticated. It's the most sophisticated combat aircraft that the Russians have, and they've upgraded them, from the 90s to now. Are they as good as most of the American stuff? No, not even close. But they are good, and they are big, and they carry up to 12 KR-55 missiles. These things have about a 400 to 600 mile range on them. Okay, so this is how these bombers work. Is they come in close enough, they come in low in the valley, and the RAF trains on this as well. They've done it with the Harriers for years. Is basically fly low to get below radar. What they find, even with all the marvels of military technology that's out there today, aircraft traveling over 500 miles an hour, below 50 feet, okay, or 100 feet, 50 feet, whatever, are almost impossible to track by ground radar. You can't lead them enough because they're going by like that. They're going by like that. So, unless it's like an open field that's like 100 miles long where they could, we could lock onto them and they'll just shoot them down like that. It makes it very difficult for aircraft to be shot down even at low levels. RAF tornado pilots, that's the main role of the Tornadoes. Now, however, a few of them do get shot down. A few of them got shot down over Iraq. But the Russians also do this too. They come in low. They come in fast. And with their Tu-22Ms, those things are, and the Su-34s, they're going to come in low, most likely over the sea. What they call sea skimming. Okay, they just basically 20 feet off the top of the water. Very hard for ships to detect because it's the ground clutter on the radar. It's hard to differentiate from targets to aircraft, from ground. So they got a lot of ground clutter. So that helps to mask. It's not undetectable, but it makes it harder. We've also had the incident with the Su-24s where they buzzed the U.S. Donald Cook 12 times and they couldn't lock onto them. Again, these are old Soviet, fighter bombers that, aka the bomb trucks, these are the type of things that would come in first to jam radars. Basically, they're like the A6 intruder or the A6 Prowler equivalent, which those aircrafts are no longer in service, but same kind of electronic warfare. So they come in, they will go into Poland, they'll go into Norway, they'll go definitely the UK, possibly France, wherever, maybe Germany, depends on how Germany responds. They're going to attack those things first, but they would definitely hit Poland first, they would definitely hit Norway. Finland depends right now. Finland's kind of on the fence whether they're going to play nice with the Russians or not. And then whatever they do in the Baltic Sea with maybe the Navy will probably go after, like, say, Sweden. Whatever. So that whole region. So a lot of people say it doesn't make sense for the Russians to roll up to the border here, go up, and then try to come around and down. Well, yes, it does, because the threat isn't... Again, they got ragtag guys shooting down MiG-29s, which even the earlier MiG-29s are still pretty, with a decent pilot in, still tough enough to shoot down. So, is the Ukrainian military a threat to the Russians? It's a nuisance to the Russians. It's not a threat to the Russians. NATO is a threat to the Russians. The F-16Cs, the F-15 Eagles. Somebody brought up the Silent Eagle. Apparently, there's only one in prototype. I've seen it. It's a neat idea for an upgrade program. But why build a Silent Eagle when they could just go back and rebuild the Black Widow and a YF-23? It's got all F-15 parts in it anyway, and it's stealthy. The F-22s, those type of things are the threats to the Russians. That's why if you're going to attack means of making war, who do you attack first? You attack NATO. Then, after, a couple of months of shooting at each other, if they win the upper hand and it doesn't go nuclear and it's just a shooting war, then you roll your tanks into Ukraine and you get payback. That's what you do. Again, I have nothing against Ukrainian people or nothing against the Russian people. These are governments that are forcing people to fight, okay? But tactically, Russia knows that when it gets into the shooting war, they're shooting at NATO first. Why? Because that's the only thing that can counter them. Now, is Russia good enough to take on NATO? Probably not. Probably not. Like, again, numbers-wise, and this is what the Russians have been pretty much telling everybody, okay? Again, I did a video the other day, and I think I left, because it was such a long video, and I left a lot of things unsaid, because there's just so much to cover. But when these bombers come in, okay, and they will be usually with a fighter escort, the way it was back in the 90s, MiG-29s protect the airfield because they're a shorter range aircraft. That's the way the Russians were setting it up. The Su-27s are an escort airplane, kind of like the P-51 escorted B-17s in the World War II. Well, that's what the Su-27 does, and it escorts a few type of aircrafts. It will sometimes escort Tu-160 Blackjacks, which is the supersonic bomber, Tu-160s, the Tu-22s, or the MiG-31. Now, some people out there, somebody commented and said, no, the MiG-31 is an interceptor, it's not a bomber. Well, they do have it as a role for interceptor. It's its main primary role, and the MiG-31, yes, is a hot-rodded aircraft from a derivative of the MiG-25. It's slightly faster than the MiG-25, a little more powerful, a little higher, a little more this, a little more range. They do have a very long ferry range of about 10,000 miles. Combat range is probably slightly less, but still considerably long. And they can be outfitted with long-range cruise missiles. And that's what I mean by bomber. So maybe the tomato thing didn't really fly there, because somebody, no, it's an interceptor. But you're missing the point. The idea is the Su-27s are the defense system for the more vulnerable, say, MiG-31 and stuff like that. MiG-31 thing is you just can't catch them. The F-15, the ones that are in service, they can't catch them. They can't catch them. They're fast. Don't get me wrong. They're fast. They can meet them, but they will not be able to stay with, it's a very short window for the F-22 and the F-15s, which are the best that the Americans have to offer, which, don't get me wrong, they are phenomenal aircraft. Yes, the F-22 is really good for what it does. I think there's a lot of playing down the actual capabilities of the F-22. It's a good airplane. If it wasn't that good, yeah, the F-35 is turning out to be a blunder. The big thing is the F-22 is you pay for the performance. I mean, for every 1 hour flown, it's about 30 hours of routine maintenance. But that's an airplane that will do a lot of things. Now, the technology is getting around the stealth, i.e. the Su-35 is still slightly more maneuverable in some ways to the F-22. For example, when you see all these nice aerobatic things that the Su-35 can do, all the desperation moves like the Cobra maneuver, the Killbutt, which is the somersault, all that, and all that stuff. Every time an Su-27 or an Su-35, which is their premier fighter for Russia, does a flanking maneuver, it goes up, it loses all its speed, comes to a bit of a hover, and then the nose goes down. And he has to gain in speed, and that's where the guy dies if he doesn't get his snapshot off. F-22 goes like this. Stops, keeps going. It doesn't go nose down. It's a more powerful airplane, right? But, again, low in numbers. There's a fair amount of F-22s. Su-34s, there's a couple, maybe, I think last count I heard is 187, between 200 and 187. Some say 300. The Russians don't keep, all you know is the Russians can mass produce things like you wouldn't believe. The biggest problem the Russians have is usually they build phenomenal equipment, but it goes into decay. They can't afford to basically maintain it. But the point I'm making is what Putin is telling people by all these airplanes buzzing the U.S. coast and stuff like that. And also, too, the Russians have sent, apparently, according to the CBC, have basically probed Ukrainian airspace with drones 10 times in the past 24 hours. Okay, so they're looking where the Ukrainians are. So whenever they want to make a hit, they're not going to send in their stuff. They're just going to tell the guys where to aim the artillery. That's it. You know what I mean? Again, they want this conflict to go on long, not short. Why? Because they need people to just scream to come over to, here's all this humanitarian aid for you. They're all going to go to the Russian side. They're call it winning the hearts and minds or manipulating the hearts and minds, however you want to look at it. So Russia's going to play this one out. They want the people to suffer there so that they demand Russia come in and help them, which will destabilize Ukraine. And you have to understand this is all about gas and oil and all that stuff. But you also have to understand when these bombers come in, they're going to come in. Again, there's not one single Russian bomber with the exception of the MiG-31, which, okay, yes, it is an interceptor, but we'll call it a fighter bomber because it's not really a fighter. More of a dedicated interceptor, but it can also be used. And the Russians have, I've seen some other, movies on how, Wings of the Red Star, I think was what it was called a few years back. And I remember they were talking about how they were going to use the MiG-31 as this, maybe that role has changed because they got the updates on the Su-34s, but the Su-24s. But the Su-24, the Tu-22M, and the Tu-160 are the main bombers. The main attack aircrafts are the Su-25s. The main escorts are the Su-27 variants. The main super fighters, the Su-35, probably, and the PAC-FA T-50 is really new. It's their stealth aircraft. And then, of course, to protect the airfields is mainly the MiG-29s. Now, these are all multi-rolled aircraft, so they can do a lot of different things, but, you know, if you're going for the specialty. But what the bombers are going to do, because, you know, like right now they keep about 100 Tu-95 Bears, which I also forgot to mention, as their bombers. These are the ones that probe all the borders, because most air forces can catch them, and it doesn't really freak out the air forces too much. But what they're saying is, yes, this airplane is going to fly 3 times slower than what the speed of your fighter is, but you have to intercept this one over here, and 100 miles away you have to get that one, and another 100 miles away you have to get that one, and that one, and that one. You got to get them all at the same time. So meaning, you'll probably, out of 5 bombers, you'll shoot 4 of them down, but the bombers only have to get within maybe cruise missile range. So the bombers don't actually fly directly over the target. To give you an idea, when the Russians dropped their atomic bomb, the Satan, basically the Tazar bomb, basically they dropped it, and the thing had a parachute to slow it down, and the Tu-95 basically went higher than the airplane's really motion. You know, it flew it to the edge of it. It's about 60,000 feet, and you know, the airplane basically barely able to fly, and then they put it into a shallow dive to gain more speed, and they barely got away. So obviously, if you drop your big firecrackers like that, you knock yourself out. But most of the sweep-up crew, the way a nuclear exchange strategic strike goes is the silos launch first. They target whichever infrastructure, city, or whatever. Followed by about an hour and a half later, submarines pop up through the ice in the Arctic. They fire missiles basically out of the Kula Typhoon, and probably the Bori-class submarines, which is the replacement for the Kula Typhoons. The Oscars use that to take out aircraft carriers. The Tu-22s usually take out aircraft carriers. And then about a week or two after all that mess is done, they send out Russian bombers and attack aircraft just to sweep up anything like infrastructure, remaining resistance. That stuff might not even be nuclear. But they can use multiple different ways of attacking. But they're going to go after what's the biggest threat to them first, which is NATO, meaning they'll go into Poland first, Norway, right? That's why they're bringing thousands of, or a couple of hundred of Abrams tanks and putting them in caves in Norway and stuff like that, to be ready for this when this happens, you know. You know, that's how they, that's what's going on right now. That's past tense. That's already, these things are already in play, you know. But the thing is these bombers will come in at multiple angles. Again, most of them will be coming in to be as undetectable as possible. Yes, most of them will get shot down. But the Russians are telling you is that with these border probes is that, you know, by the time you guys respond to us, we've already destroyed, you know, again, Tu-160 puts out these 12 missiles. So now you've got the aircraft, but it launched its predetermined missiles within its range. And the next one, you got 16 of these times 12. Okay? Now, the Tu-95s, you got, I think they carry 8 or 12 missiles as well. They got 12. The Tu-22s, they might have 6 or 8, or maybe 2, whatever. But whatever number of aircraft it is, the cruise missiles are become, you know, because once the bomber has released its payload, the bombers, you want to shoot down the cruise missiles, because that's what's going to do the damage. So that's how the Russians are going to do it. And again, you know, they know where to hit right away. They know exactly what they're going to shoot at. It doesn't mean they're going to win. But what it does mean, and this is Putin's message all the way, is you're definitely going to have skin in the game if you start a shooting war with us. We might lose, but we'll take you with us. And the loss of humanity will be devastating. But most of the things they're going to go after, obviously, are things that can pose a threat to them. They might not necessarily just wipe out civilian populations, but that is a part of the plan to take out a certain amount of populations just so your country suffers. Great movie to see. It's older, but by Dawn's Early Light, that explains an awful lot of how the Strategic Command works. Okay, in the U.S. Okay, now a lot of that stuff has changed since then. Okay, but you get an idea of how they do it. Now the Russians always have the same counterpart. In 2010 or 2011 or 2012, when the Chinese, and I will bring the Chinese in on this too, when the Chinese came out and said, "Look, our nuclear submarines are capable of firing missiles up to 12,000 miles." So just so you know, what they're telling you is that you will not. You know, if you get into a war with us, you might win, but you're not going to. You're going to take some massively heavy losses. You know, and again, when it just comes down to a numbers game, you can't shoot down everything that's going to be thrown at you, and that goes back to the primary philosophy of the Russians: strength in numbers. A lot of the stuff they have sitting there in mothballs. Su-27s is a good. Again, I know there's somebody that I was talking to, and they made up these points. Said, yeah, but they have a lot of stuff that they don't use. That's true. That is true. But it's so quick for them to, you know. For 96 hours, they've got everything back. Russian stuff, particularly the older stuff, is typically simple to get running. It's give you an idea. The Ka-52 attack helicopter is designed to run half an hour without any oil in the engine. It's also designed to run with for 2 weeks without maintenance. that's what, low tech kind of works no matter what. Even if only 10% of your force stays, I think in Iraq they kept a 96% availability rate on the U.S. So if the Russians can keep even 10% of what they got, they still outnumber everything. And again, the idea was always overwhelm them with numbers, strength in numbers. I mean, heck, they would probably send out the Frogfoots maybe even first just to be sacrificial lambs because they got 6,000 of them to lose. So, you got a Frogfoot attacking a town, the fighter jets go over to do that. Or you've got the Tu-160 coming in with 2 Su-27s. Well, the Su-27s go distract the fighter pilots long enough so that the bomber can get through. And then once the bomber releases its payload, it doesn't matter if they lose the bomber and the 2 fighters because the damage will have been done. At that point, if you can't shoot down the cruise missiles, so that's how, and they would come in low, they would come in fast. Oftentimes, for example, it was Sweden basically got buzzed by the Russians about, I think this was last year or the year before, whatever. They get buzzed by the Russians, but it was a Friday afternoon and all the pilots had went home. And they basically, I think it was either Sweden or, not Sweden, Denmark or Norway had to respond. I can't remember which ones responded anyway. I might have the countries wrong. But anyway, they had to call up another Air Force. Can you go and kind of go meet those Russian bombers? Their pilots got home for the weekend. But you see what I mean, like stuff like that. You get your pants caught with your pants down, you can see what bad things can happen. So I guess I'm going on a little bit long now, but I just wanted to clear up that. So yes, if they do invade, they're going to be going through the country that poses the biggest threat to them right now is Poland, because that's where there's tons of NATO, and then of course you have all the, basically the Russians have been planning on, okay, who are we going to attack first? They're not going to even just come straight in at Poland. They're going to probably come in from the other angle where you don't expect it. But they would probably have a big distraction force, i.e. build up all along, like roll the tanks right to the border, maybe fire a couple of shots in there to make it look good. While NATO's buzzing around waiting for Russians to come across the line, and now I'm sure NATO is aware of this, but you get the idea. The whole reason why NATO exists is because of the numbers of the Russians. So now China, they're sitting back and being quiet on this, but they would side with the Russians and they would use pretty much the same tactics as the Russians for the most part. Although they don't have as many aircraft or as good a quality, they do have enough stuff. Again, it's the numbers problem, So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Oh, and also too, the first attack would probably actually, before they would roll into Poland, they would probably take their Venezuelan forces and now Cuban forces and roll into the U.S. border. Who's going to catch them? It's already wide open, right? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. So rate, subscribe, share, comment, and like. Hey. Don't do that. Okay, good. G'day, hi, and welcome. All right, so World War III update. Why not? Sure. Yeah, I'll do it. I'm good for it. Okay. MiG-29 shot down over Ukraine. Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. Sometimes it does this, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, yeah. So MiG-29 shot down. Reports of more Russian aircraft, anti-aircraft equipment going across into the Ukraine. Whether it's true or not, who knows? The convoy is stuck at the border. Yeah, so it's still, tensions are as high as they could be in the Ukraine. So not a big report here, but you can see it is escalating. I mean, the Russians, whether they're in Kiev or not in Kiev, but in the Donetsk region or not, is not really a no-brainer, but it's not really an impossibility either. But what I'm more thinking is what they're doing is they're training most of the guys, and I know like some of these surface-to-air missile systems do take a lot of training to use them properly, but you can show a monkey how to get it working, you know what I mean? So it does look like, okay, now you got a MiG-29 shot down, the pilot did eject. This isn't a big deal, but it just kind of shows you that the Air Force, Ukrainian Air Force, cannot really seem to make good headway into that region. So that means, what they're getting shot down faster than they can return fire, okay, and destroy the surface-to-air missile systems. So when Crimea was basically repatriated by the, annexed by the Russians, there was a convoy of S-300 missile systems that did go into that region. Now, Crimea is not even mentioned on the mainstream media. Nobody's talking about it because they know for sure that the Russians are there. My thing is this: if the Russians are supplying the rebels, which they are, and again, you have to understand, you have basically Blackwater guys. You have, Russian Secret Service running around there. You've got all these factions in there. You've probably got about 20 different factions, including the Mossad. They're all in there. They're all in there. But the problem is that the people that are getting caught in the crossfire deliberately are suffering the most. Now, Russia doesn't mind these people suffering. Why? Because every time the Ukrainian forces do something to them, well, they're just like in 10 years, they've conquered half the country, and it's now going to be like an East-West Germany kind of setup. But the thing is the Ukrainian forces cannot seem to really, really make that good of headway. They gain some ground, but again, you're fighting an insurgency. You can't win an insurgency. You just can't win that unless you just completely genocide everybody that's there, which, it's not like they're not trying to do that. Again, what they're doing on the eastern side of Ukraine is identical to what Israel's doing to the Gazans, or the Palestinians in Gaza. So, there's no difference, and so there's no good guys there, just a lot of innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. So what does this entail? So if you really do have more Russian stuff, again, they never show you anything. It's funny how they can tell, oh yeah, well, we're watching it in real time and everything, but we're not going to show you because we want to show you our intelligence. Well, then, why would you even admit it? You know what I mean? Like, why would you even say they're doing this unless, they won't show you anything. So what I'm thinking is that, yes, it's still the rebels being trained by the Russians on the Russian side, and then they just come over as they see fit and go back and forth. That said, I made a couple of videos the other day. I didn't get a chance to post them, and I'm going to post them all today. And I know some of them are long and stuff like that, but I'm still waiting for the desperate Ukrainian pilot or whatever, most likely going to be a pilot. I would assume they would use the Su-27 because of its longer range and try to make a really deep strike somewhere into Russia. Getting shot down into Russia, then you would see it ratchet up to the next level. But again, when they're shooting down MiG-29s, MiG-29 is, even the older ones now, the Ukrainians didn't get, they've got the Russian hand-me-down. So yes, the Russians still fly MiG-29s, and they got quite a few of them. I think there was like 1,600 built or whatever. I mean, those numbers change. The Russians never kept serial numbers on stuff. You don't know how many's out there.